Once the trench was ready, side-boom tractors lifted the pipe and supported it in motion on roller cradles. Behind them came a self-propelled cleaning and priming machine. Its function was to clean off rust and scale and apply a coat of primer. Arab workers trailed it to touch up any spots that were missed. In the wake of the cleaning and priming machine came a coat and wrap machine. This ingenious contrivance, also self-propelled, coated the pipe with hot liquid asphalt from a big kettle, wrapped it with glass fiber, then coated it again. Now the pipe was ready to be put underground. Writhing like a giant serpent, it was lowered gently into its trench, but not to rest. Its life was only beginning, and its pulse would endure long after the shifting sands of the desert had hidden all trace of the recent activity. The great stockpile of pipe maintained at Ras El Mishad continued month after month to feed the plant where the 31-foot joints were automatically welded together into 93-foot sections. Day after day, the big pipe trucks, each with its 40-ton trailer load, lined up for inspection. Then they rolled out of the base camp and headed for the right-of-way. They were always on the move, and each succeeding trip was a little longer than the last. Besides the pipe went convoy after convoy of all manner of equipment, building materials, foodstuffs, and fuel. The truck-trailer combinations carried the tonnages of freight trains. The freight hauled overland for tap line was growing into a total of 150 million ton miles. Such loads could not be delivered with dependable regularity over mere trails, so men and machines forged ahead, building and maintaining access roads that would stand up under constant heavy traffic. More than 1,200 miles of mainline highway and access roads were built, not only serving the immediate needs of construction and operation, but also opening up a through artery for commercial motor traffic for the first time across Saudi Arabia between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. It was a big job just to keep in repair the low-pressure tires used on all the trucks, trailers, and graders. There were the giant 50-ton truck tractors for hauling pipe, and hundreds of other vehicles of various types, besides all the earth-moving machinery. There was altogether about $18 million worth of equipment, all of which had to be maintained. At the outlying camps and at Ras El Mishab, staffs of mechanics and machinists were kept busy the clock round. New camps were set up at convenient intervals for the construction crew. All of the buildings could either be dismantled or picked up bodily and carted from place to place as needed. Each camp had its own self-contained plumbing system, so that men who came in from a hard day's work, tired and hot and dirty, could relax under a shower. And each camp had a well-run mess hall, where wholesome food was plentiful. Besides canned goods, there were frozen fresh fruits and vegetables and meats and even milk, all shipped in refrigerator boxes from the other side of the globe. To all of the men on the job and to all of the wayfarers in this arid land, there was a commodity of far greater immediate value than oil. And that, of course, was water. 52 wells were drilled at strategic locations, and 40 of them brought in water. Most of it was brackish, but it was plentiful, and all of it was precious. A new water supply was thus created not only for future pump stations, but also for the Bedouins and their livestock. As one well after another was brought in, concrete troughs were set up. The word spread among the tribes. Soon, thousands of camels, sheep, and goats were brought to drink their fill. The new watering stations were regarded as permanent public utilities. Thanks to tap lines, life became easier for man and beast in a harsh environment. In the spring of 1949, construction was started on the first of 4 big pump stations assigned by tap line to International Bechtel. Averaging 170-odd miles apart along the right-of-way, there were to be 6 stations for the entire pipeline system, all within Saudi Arabia. Each was to be an installation costing millions of dollars. At each, there were to be pumping units with a capacity exceeding 300,000 barrels of oil per day, and accommodations and all facilities for a permanent staff of a score of Americans and a couple of hundred Arabs. In the tremendous program of transportation and construction, Arabs now outnumbered Americans by as many as 14 to 1. At the peak of activity, more than 14,000 Arabs were at work on the Tapline project. Through on-the-job training, they were playing increasingly important roles. Most were employed through Arab subcontractors, who themselves had been set up in business by Aramco or Tapline. Men who only a short while ago had never seen modern machinery were operating equipment of all sorts. The majority of these men, including many Bedouins, had been reared in an atmosphere that had changed little in 1,000 years. When they came to work with Americans on the Tapline project, every American had to become a teacher. The Arabs proved surprisingly adaptable. Not merely did they learn to do unaccustomed tasks, but they also managed to bridge a wide cultural and linguistic gap. But with all their technological training, their basic thinking remained inviolate, and they continued to abide faithfully by the precepts of the Prophet. As originally planned, the pipeline was to have been pushed simultaneously from both ends. But the situation arising from events in Palestine delayed field work at the Mediterranean end until the fall of 1949. Here, the scenery was in sharp contrast to that of Arabia. The city of Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, was headquarters for the Western Division of Tapline. And 35 miles to the south, the terminal site for the pipeline was hard by the town of Sidon, seaport of ancient Phoenicia, with its castle built by the Crusaders. The right-of-way passed picturesque hamlets perched on rugged hillsides, where terraces for the cultivation of figs, grapes, and cereals had been carved out by patient peasants countless generations ago. Eastward, from the Mediterranean, the route continued up hill and down dale. Along a certain stretch, one could look up at the silhouette of Beaufort Castle, another stronghold of the Crusaders. Right away went from Lebanon into Syria, then across the kingdom of Hashemite Jordan to Saudi Arabia. This comprised the Western Division, 214 miles, whose construction was assigned by Tapline to Williams Brothers Overseas Company. By September 1950, the forces of Williams Brothers were putting the finishing touches on the Sidon terminal. 16 180,000-barrel storage tanks were erected at Sidon by Graver Construction Company, which was also building one of the pump stations in Saudi Arabia. At all the other stations, the tankage was put up by Chicago Bridge and Iron Company. The pipeliners were now tying in some of the last of the shorelines that would carry crude oil from the storage tanks to submarine lines for the loading of tankers. Meanwhile, along the right-of-way through Saudi Arabia, installations had arisen on the empty desert as if by the magic of the Arabian Nights. But the modern magic from which they sprang resulted from painstaking planning and the hard toil of hundreds of Americans and thousands of Arabs under the severest imaginable climatic conditions nearly halfway around the world from the sources of supply. All four of the pump stations whose construction had been undertaken by International Bechtel were now in the final stages of cleanup and testing. Soon each of these stations would be dispatching its daily quota of oil. Just to fill the Tapline system, including the tankage and the line itself, would take 6 million barrels of oil, more than all the oil pumped in a day from all the wells in the United States. One of the most extraordinary of all engineering and construction projects ever carried out by private enterprise was now about to bear fruit. And well it might, for the cost would be in the neighborhood of $230 million. It was financed by Standard Oil Company of California the Texas Company, Standard Oil Company, New Jersey, and Soconi Vacuum Oil Company, Incorporated, without government support of any kind. Of these companies, there are upwards of 500,000 private stockholders. The pipeliners were nearing the end of their trek. Month after month, perfectly coordinated teams of Arabs and Americans had been finishing more than a mile of pipeline every day. In areas where solid rock prevented economical trenching, the pipe was carefully settled into ring girders mounted on concrete piers. The below-ground sections, after having been cleaned, primed, coated, and wrapped, were effortlessly lowered in by skillfully manipulated side-boom tractors. Around the end of a section of pipe on the desert of northern Saudi Arabia, 4 men gathered one day in mid-September. One was an executive of Transarabian Pipeline Company. 2 were executives of International Bechtel Incorporated, and the other was a construction superintendent. Theirs was an informal visit, but the occasion was significant, for they were inspecting the northwesterly end of a continuous line leading 854 miles from the oil center of Abqaiq. This was it. This meant for Bechtel the wind-up of another contract. Only the last few hundred yards of pipe remained to be coated and wrapped. All that lay behind was welded and tested and safe in the ground or mounted on piers, with oil already coursing through it from pump station to pump station. The machine ground steadily forward, and the Arabs and Americans guiding it performed their various jobs just as though this day were no different from any other. Suddenly, their machine reached its goal. In a few days, the crew from the Mediterranean would be along with their end of the line to make the final tie-in. Now, through the Transarabian pipeline system, flows the oil of Saudi Arabia to the storage tanks of Sidon. And into the blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea dip the submarine lines that load the oil into tankers, riding at anchor a mile from shore. The initial maximum output of the line was 300,000 barrels per day, but with an extra half-dozen pump stations, it could be increased to 500,000 barrels. Through government royalties, through education, and through new industrial activities, the Arabs are benefiting enormously from tap lines. At the same time, the Aramco and tap line organizations and their investors stand to be rewarded for their courage and imagination. And finally, the ready supply of oil made available by the Transarabian pipeline system will hasten the reconstruction of Western Europe and strengthen it for peace.